Welcome to Scary Stories for a Rainy Night, Volume 66. Before we get into the stories, I want to give a quick shout out to Hunt a Killer for sponsoring this video. If you're anything like me, you love horror movies. And if you're anything like me, you love a good mystery. The days are short, the weather is getting colder. It's the perfect time to put on a pot of coffee and immerse yourself in the Hunt a Killer experience. Upon subscribing to Hunt a Killer, they will send you a box every month, and each package is what they call an episode. And inside each package will be everything you need to solve a case in connection to a blockbuster horror movie. The first case I received was for the Blair Witch Project. Inside the package were photos, case files, news reports, a journal, and items that you will need to research the information that's given to you so that you can solve the mystery. The meticulousness and attention to detail in these cases is amazing. I could not believe how engaging and addicting my case was. I'm telling you right now, it's not easy, and it will take all the detective skills you have to solve them. Not only was my experience addicting, but it gave me legitimate uneasy feels, and at times it felt like I was sitting in an abandoned house where a crime scene took place, searching through evidence. Experience it while home alone at night. I dare you. Combine your love for horror movie mysteries and games. Experience Hunt a Killer. Go to huntakiller.com/being scared, and don't forget to use the code being scared for a 20% discount off your first box. This is not for the faint of heart. Can you survive the curse of the Blair Witch? Quick reminder, only 3 mid-roll ads in this video. One after story number 1, one after story number 2, and one more after story number 3. This gets them out of the way so you can enjoy the rest of the video ad-free. Please help me out and show your support by liking this video and subscribing to my channel so that you never miss a future video. Now, let's begin. My mother's side of the family is fairly vast. She has 3 brothers and 3 sisters, all of whom are married and have several kids of their own. It goes without saying that when summer rolled around and it was time for the annual family vacation, there would be endless hours of fun and entertainment. My grandparents were fairly wealthy individuals, and with a share of their fortune each year, they would rent out a lake house, cabin, or beachside mansion for our family to resort at in its entirety. For the year in question, my grandparents decided to rent out a large 4-story lakeside home. It was complete with a dock, game room, movie theater, vast kitchen, and even a tube slide system that went from floor to floor. What was supposed to be a blissful escape would soon become home to one of my worst memories to date. Before we delve any deeper into the story, I would like to do a quick explanation of the layout of the home because it's pertinent to the understanding of the rest of the story. The house was built upon a very steep slope that led down to a lake. The house was literally built horizontally off of the side of the hill. So on the part of the home that wasn't connected to the hill, there were long stilts that connected to the base of the home to the bottom of the hill. For additional support of the home, brick was added in between the stilts, creating a vast canaveral-like room underneath the home, only accessible by a cellar door at the bottom floor of the house. This pit, or room, had no insulation. Dirt floors, which in reality was just the bottom of the hill, and filled with spiders and other small rodents and such. It was highly recommended by the homeowners who we were renting the property from that we do not venture down into this area because it would be a 10 or so foot drop to the floor and no ladder for assistance returning to the bottom floor of the home. So anyone that found themselves in this place would practically be imprisoned in a tall, dark cement hole. Alright, back to the story. After all the pleasantries with my family and settling in for the first couple nights, all the more mature members of the family, which included me, my brother, and all my aunts, uncles, and their significant others, decided to play a game commonly known as sardines. The game is basically inverse hide and seek, where there is one hider and the rest of the players are seekers. All the lights in the home are turned off, creating an atmosphere of complete darkness. The hider is given a minute to hide, and once they are settled, the seekers begin their hunt. If a seeker happens upon the hider, then they silently slip away and hide in the same place as the hider until all people are hidden and only one seeker remains. Now that you have a quick synopsis of the game, house, and large number of people playing, you can see how this could be the perfect concoction for a fun time. My Uncle Mike was the one selected to do the hiding first. We shut out all the lights in the home, and after the given minute of hiding time, the hunt was on. My brother, aunts, uncles, and I searched the first couple floors to no avail, searching under each table, in each closet, and behind each couch. After about 15 minutes of searching, and nobody seemed to have found him, an idea sprouted in my head. Though I dismissed the thought at first, I couldn't stop thinking about that cellar door and that space that lay beneath the home. Being that I was on the younger end of the family, around 17 years old, I wanted to impress them by being the first one to find him. So I silently crept away from the group and down the last 2 stories I had to go to get to the bottom floor of the house where the cellar doors were. When I got there, I found my body physically shaking with adrenaline, and after opening the door that closed off the little closet-sized room that held the cellar doors, I was trembling with fear. They just looked so ominous, and in the dark lighting, I walked up to them and placed a hand on each of the handles. Before I even opened the door, I was able to hear scuffling and maniacal giggling from the room. This assured me even more that I had found him, and my fear turned into excitement when I learned of his presence. I flung the doors open and looked down into the dark abyss of the hole. I quietly whispered down at my uncle, telling him that I had found him and that I was going to drop down and join him. He just kept laughing and laughing, which really unnerved me because it was unlike him to do that sort of thing, without at least admitting he had been found or telling me to join him. Really wanting to be the first seeker to find him, I slowly began lowering myself down into the hole, hanging onto the ledge of the cellar door and letting my feet dangle into the hole. I could hear his laughter getting louder and heard his footing shifting as he began to walk closer to me. A horrid stench assaulted me the second that I lowered the rest of my body into the hole. I still clung to the cellar door, not allowing myself to drop the extra 5 feet or so. Being that I was closer to the ground now, I could start to begin to see his shape, and it looked off. I couldn't make out facial features, but seeing his slouched posture and lanky arms made me hold onto the ledge of the cellar door for a moment longer in hesitation. In that moment, I heard my aunt's voice calling for me, telling me they had all found my uncle, and that I was the last to find him. My mind didn't piece the two together instantly, but when it did, saying that I could feel my heart sink to my stomach wouldn't be an exaggeration. The immense, overwhelming fear that I felt in that moment, I have yet to feel ever again. Without a moment's hesitation, I pulled myself up out of the hole and instantly ran to my aunt, calling for help, screaming about the man underneath the house. She looked confused at first, but sprung into action when she too heard the laughing from the hole. She called my uncles down while she phoned the police and gave them my quick description of the man. But because we were in the middle of nowhere, it took them about 25 minutes to arrive. When they finally did, it was a flurry of red and blue lights. But what unnerved me the most was that a full SWAT team arrived as well. A dozen men poured into the home, which felt intense for what seemed like a mentally ill home invader. Within moments, they came out carrying a deranged-looking man in handcuffs. It wasn't until later on did I get the full details of the story. The man that they had arrested was indeed a mentally insane person with a warrant out for his arrest for the mutilation of his ex-wife. I also found later that the stench that was coming out of the room was his feces. It appeared he had been trapped down there for several days. He claimed he had gotten himself stuck down there when he had initially broken into the cellar to elude police capture. It has been around 3 years since this incident, and its memory has become less and less intense with each passing day. However, some nights I lie awake at night, thankful that I did not let go of that cellar's ledge. I don't fly anymore. I used to, a lot, actually. It was a big part of my job to fly around the country to pitch investment prospects at meetings held for wealthy hedge fund managers. It was a cushy job. I mean, it paid far, far more than it was worth. But now I work from home, and I drive everywhere. I'm talking everywhere. I live in New York City, but my parents live down in Florida since they retired. And yep, I drive down there to see them, 3 times a year sometimes. It's pretty bad, but I'd rather drive all that way and get stomach flu from bad roadside tacos than fly. And now I'll tell you why. It was a regular flight from LaGuardia down to Houston, another business trip to finance flirt with oil-rich investors down in Texas. I was sat in a window seat in business class. Takeoff was pretty normal. Everything was peachy. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before as I thumbed through the in-flight magazine and browsed the drinks menu. I had to get up at like 5:30 in order to make the flight, and I have never been a morning person. So as soon as I was able, I shut the window flap next to me, closed my eyes, and tried to catch a few Z's so I would be as fresh as possible for the afternoon meeting. Then, just as I'm about to drift off, the loud pop noise. In my weary state, I actually thought it was some champagne bottle being opened by some celebratory suit who was opting for the fizz breakfast. I look around, and no one has a bottle. There's no attendant with an ice bucket. Nothing like that. Then, some horrible idea pops into my head, and in order to belay my seemingly irrational fears, I slide open to check on the plane's left wing engine. I remember expecting it to be fine. Nothing had ever happened on a flight before, even though I had had those little flashes of fear previously. But it was not fine. The popping sound had been exactly what I had feared. There was smoke billowing from the engine, a thick stream of dark vapor that trailed along as we flew. I grabbed an attendant and silently pointed out the window, not wanting to raise too much of a panic. When she looked, she turned pale, then rushed up the aisle in the direction of the cockpit. Moments later, others were noticing what I had seen, cries of panic sounding from all along the plane as more and more people noticed the danger we were in. People were rushing over to the left side of the plane, looking out the windows and screaming, all while the air hostesses aboard were trying everything they could to both keep calm, as well as keeping the passengers calm. Right before the terror reached a fever pitch, the pilot comes over the intercom. I think that was the weirdest, most surreal moment of my life, when people were losing their minds, but the captain was calm to the point of seeming bored. I suppose that's just the level of training they receive. The captain tells everyone to keep calm, to go back to their seats, and that the plane will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport, which by that time was an airport in Virginia. We actually landed just fine, and the only remotely bad thing to really happen that day was that I had to rearrange the investment meeting. But I swear, part of me thought that plane was about to become a fireball as the engine exploded and we plummeted towards the earth at like 500 miles an hour. It was probably the most terrifying experience I have ever endured, and despite me trying to, I was never able to get on a plane ever again. So like I said, I drive everywhere now, and as much as it sucks, It's better than getting the cold sweats and panic attacks from sitting on a runway somewhere, just waiting for the engines to go up in flames. So, this story is a bit unsettling and weird. The events of this night I didn't really consider scary until years later when I really reflected on what truly happened. I am 30 years old now, but was only 15 during the events of this story. The evening started fairly normal. A bunch of my friends and I just hanging out, thinking we were cool because we were at the state fair without any adults. It was a group of about 10 of us if I remember correctly. We decided to post up towards the back of the fairgrounds where all the rides were. We were just talking, telling jokes, and trying to impress the girls that would occasionally walk by. During our time hanging out in the back, we were approached by a very strange-looking person. He was an average height, a little thick in the belly, bald but was sporting some hair on the sides. He approached us with great confidence and said in a stern voice, "You guys waiting for the ship as well?" Thinking this was more comical than scary, we kind of just laughed and responded with, the ship? What are you talking about?" The man smiled and flashed his chipped teeth and again, in his confident voice, said, "Yeah, the ship from space. Are you guys here to board as well?" Well, being kids, we just thought this was a joke. We laughed hysterically and just thought this guy had a lot to drink or something along those lines. After we had finished basically laughing in the guy's face, I finally responded to him saying, "Where's the ship going?" He responded confidently, "The Andromeda Galaxy, of course." That was the last straw for us. We were just about hunched over in pain. We were laughing so hard. Well, the man finally realized we were laughing at him and changed his tune real quick. The confident voice suddenly became faint, and the man said, "Go ahead and laugh at me. When they come, you will see." We responded by basically saying whatever and stepped away from this crazy guy. At this point, he started to follow us and was now irate, chasing us, and was yelling about the aliens. Finally, after a few minutes of this, and lots of stares from the people at the fair, I turned around and said in my blunt 15-year-old voice, "Dude, leave us alone. We don't want any part of your ship or aliens." Still treating this as a joke, but more annoyed and creeped out than anything else, we just kept walking. The man finally yelled, "Stop!" We all turned and looked at the creepy UFO man, and he said almost in tears now, "I've seen you in my dreams. You've been on the ship with me. They chose us." Officially creeped out, I pushed the guy away. He surprisingly went backwards quickly, like he weighed nothing. After that, he just started laughing. With all the commotion, we noticed many fairgoers forming a circle around us to make sure there wasn't an issue escalating. The crazy man started pacing around the circle of people that formed, and started to ask everyone, in almost a desperate voice now, "Are any of you going up? They will be here soon. We need to get ready." This poor guy was met with tons of laughter. I started to feel bad for him. It seemed like this person was really suffering from some sort of crazed delusion. While the man was interrogating the other fairgoers, we used the opportunity to make our way to the main entrance. Honestly, we were just done with the guy and done with the night. It was starting to get concerning, and we really didn't want any trouble or to have something happen that would need our parents to get involved. Once we got to the main entrance, we took a shuttle back to the parking lot, where my mom was picking me up, along with 3 of my friends. We got to the lot, and she was not there yet, so we just waited by the entrance to the lot until my mom got there. Right on cue, directly across from the lot, which is essentially a heavily wooded area, we saw the same guy just standing there, staring at us. We did not say or do anything to provoke him this time. We just watched and waited anxiously for my mom. As we stood there, we noticed that the man just kept pointing up to the sky. He didn't look like he was saying anything, but we wouldn't have been able to hear him if he was anyway, because he was probably at least 100 yards away. In the distance, we finally saw my mom driving up in our green Windstar van. As we approached the doors of the van, we noticed the man was now somewhat rapidly approaching us. Not running, but walking briskly, I would say. We started to move fast, not really knowing if this guy was dangerous or not. And as I got into the passenger side, the man waved from the side of the road, and I just barely heard him say, "I'll see you up there," as he smiled awkwardly at the van. It was not until years later when I was telling this story that I realized just how disturbing it really was. We had no idea if this guy could have caused us harm, if he was insane, or if by some crazy chance there was some truth to his delusion. I often used to wonder what happened to that guy. I never saw him again. I still attend the fair every year, and honestly, I always go back to that spot at the back of the grounds to see if the strange man would ever come back. Either way, it was a very strange and interesting story I really wanted to share. Just makes you wonder what goes on in other people's minds and what their true intentions are. This story takes place 2 years ago, when I was living in the same house as my 2 younger sisters and my father. We lived in a neighborhood that wasn't necessarily unsafe, but wasn't the best neighborhood for people to live in. I can recall some neighbors getting arrested for selling drugs when I was maybe 5, but this story is not about them. In the summer of 2018, my sisters and I would stay up late into the night, sometimes only going to bed after the sun had risen. I was 17, and my sisters were 15 and 13. My father would go to bed early, as he was a responsible adult. To explain the situation best, I need to describe what my house looked like. It was a 1-story home, with 4 doors on the front of my house, 3 of which opened to our living room, and 1 of which opened to my bedroom. Our backyard fence had been knocked down by a storm recently, and we had 2 doors on the back of the house, one that opened to the kitchen, and one that opened to my father's room. One night, around 12:30 a.m., I was doing what I usually did. I was listening to scary stories on my phone, as I made art on my iPad. I didn't use earbuds because I've always been paranoid that something might happen while I'm using them. My sisters, who shared a room down the hall from me, were doing whatever they did at night. It didn't really concern me. My father was fast asleep in his room. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I always end up very on edge while I'm listening to scary stories, so I'm hyper aware of what's going on around me. You can imagine how hard I jumped when I heard a sharp pounding on our front door. 4 hard thuds could be heard throughout the house, and I could hear the front door shake with the strength of each knock. I held my breath, hoping that I had heard wrong. I really didn't want to think someone was at my front door. At this moment, my middle sister, Jen, came running into my room, trying to keep her steps silent. She looked at me, eyes wild. "You heard that too, right?" she asked, voice trembling. I swallowed and nodded, heart pounding in my chest. "We need to go wake Dad up," I responded, and started towards my father's bedroom. She followed diligently behind me. On our way to our dad's room, my youngest sister, Ness, peeked her head out from her room. She, too, looked scared. I opened my dad's door and shook him awake, trembling slightly. One of my worst fears is someone breaking into our house. "Dad, someone's at the front door." Even as I said this, I felt sick. "Ugh, what?" my dad said, groggy and not at all happy that we had woken him up. "There's someone here," Jen whispered. "I heard it. Someone knocked on the door," I said. My dad slowly got out of bed. He knows that my sisters and I always jump to the worst conclusions whenever anything happens, so he assumed we were doing the same here. I watched silently as he went to the front door, my stomach leaping to my throat. "There's no one out there," he told my sisters and I, absolutely unimpressed as he looked through the blinds. My heart sank a little. I kind of started to doubt myself, but my sisters had heard the knocking too, so I knew I wasn't alone in this. We tried to reason with him before he went back to bed, but he didn't believe us, too tired to really care about what we were saying. Dejected but scared, I ended up taking my mattress off my bed and sleeping in my sister's room for the night, taking a baseball bat and laying it next to my mattress. My overactive imagination had me thinking that whoever was at the door was out to hurt us, and I knew I would have to defend my younger sisters against any danger that dared to enter our house. The next day passed just fine. My sisters and I knew that we had heard something, and our dad brushed off our attempts to explain it. He thought we were sleep deprived, or perhaps that a large bug had hit our door, which was ridiculous. It wasn't until 11 p.m. that night, when my father was lounging on one of the couches in the living room, that we heard the pounding again. Only this time, it was much more aggressive, and directly on the door behind my father. My father let out a loud, "What the?" and charged towards the front door. I had been standing in the living room when the pounding occurred again, and my sisters had rushed to stand next to me after hearing my father shout. We were all shaken. Our father never yelled like that. I started to cry as my father went to rush outside and confront whoever was out there. I begged him not to go outside because I thought he might get hurt. He told my sisters and I to call the cops, and he cursed some more when he realized that whoever had knocked on the door was gone. My sisters called the cops, and they arrived fairly quickly, talking with my dad about what was going on, claiming that there had been other complaints about this happening nearby, and explaining that they would try their best to find out who was doing it. The police did a search around our house, but didn't find anyone, even searching the backyard, where I was afraid the perpetrator might be. The police assured us that someone would patrol the neighborhood that night. Once the cops were gone, my dad apologized for not believing us the night before. We said it was okay, and left it at that. He locked all the doors and stayed up later than my sisters and I. I couldn't calm down, so I slept in my sister's room that night as well. Eventually, though, I put this situation behind me. A few months had passed, but not without nightmares and sleep paralysis about the whole ordeal. Most nightmares ending with someone breaking in and hurting my sisters. Other nightmares ending in more brutal ways. I had thought nothing more of the whole thing. That is until one day, I came home from school and Ness ran up to me, buzzing with energy. She proceeded to tell me that, apparently, the cops had found out who was knocking on everyone's doors about a month or so ago. It was an older man who lived a few houses down from us. They had gotten him to stop, and I am not sure if he was given a warning or whatever. He was a little unstable mentally, and nobody had opened their doors for him. Ness then told me that the same guy had been arrested earlier this day. I was shocked. He had only been knocking on people's doors at odd hours of the night. I'm happy to say that he is in jail and no longer lives in that neighborhood. I haven't done any more looking into his crime other than trying to confirm it for myself the day he was arrested. I'm also happy to say that after another recent event where someone tried to break into our house, my father installed a Ring doorbell, the doorbell with a camera, which gave my sisters and I some comfort. I really hope this man gets what he deserves, or maybe that he gets the help that he needs, if he really is insane. Former funeral director here. The cemetery I run is really old, like by a good few hundred years. At least it must be, since the church next to it was constructed during the 17th century. Considering the fact that it is a pretty rural place as well, most people back in the day were buried with only wooden crosses and such, no stone or marble. So as time goes on, crosses rot and wither away. New people get buried, etc. Nowadays, due to less people living out here in the sticks, the cemetery is really run down and overgrown. So as some of you can imagine, when you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of dirt for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been worked over dozens and dozens of times. So in the end, it consists mainly of bone meal. You can't even rake over the flower beds there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something equally grim. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles the kind of dirt you would see near sandy beaches, except on closer examination, all the light-colored parts are just bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just super eerie until you eventually get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. Anyway, so someone was taking care of their relative's grave and decided to expand the area around the grave. For some reason, the people around here are not particularly fond of grass, rather preferring a well-leveled ground with Zen garden lines made with a rake. The person removed the grass and was sprucing up the place with a rake when they pulled up a bunch of snow-white hair from the dirt. They must have freaked out and ran out of there, leaving the cemetery attendant to stumble across what is essentially hair coming out of the ground. She reported it to the church and supposedly they reburied the remains. Even with all my years as an undertaker, I'm not entirely sure how there could have been a body so close to the surface. But there's another incident that sticks with me even more than that one. My business partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 27-year-old woman who tragically passed away. As we were moving her body from the cot to the embalming table, we heard an audible click, and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios where you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn on. We both looked at each other, pale as ghosts. He happened to be an extremely religious man, and this event visibly shook him. He found an excuse to leave early, not long after the incident. I shut the radio off as I typically used my iPhone to listen to music while doing embalming work. When I had finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table, I heard that click from that old radio, and it turned on full volume, yet again. At that point I was fairly freaked out, and left not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge, before or after. Just a few days ago, I had the strangest experience I have had in the 10+ years of driving a cab. I picked up this well-dressed and good-looking middle-aged man. However, when he opened his mouth, he said the strangest things. What started out as an entertaining discussion ended up as an all-consuming fear. I'm going to explain everything. Saturday night, I was working the graveyard shift. Most of my fares come from bars. I had just dropped off a pair of drunk women. It was around 3 a.m. when I noticed a well-dressed, tall man waving me down. The neighborhood combined with his fancy suit spoke possible big tipper to me. Once he got in and closed the door, he removed his hat, a fine-looking straw fedora. His clothing and movie star good looks were out of place. I feared at first that I'd picked up a time traveler. I did the usual and asked him where he was headed. "I don't know, really. I'm in town on business and I was looking for someone to show me around." His answer made me chuckle. It seemed awful late for a sightseeing trip. As long as you're paying, mister, I'll drive you anywhere." And that was how it all started. For the next 2 hours or so, I showed him around town. The university, the Capitol building, the usual touristy stuff. At some point during our little tour, I remembered why he said he was in town. "So what kind of business are you in?" His reply made me laugh even more than his first. The guy was a natural comedian. I'm what some people would call a contract killer. We had been having such a good time so far, I decided to go ahead with the ruse. Okay, mister, I'll play along. Tell me how it works. How does one go about hiring a contract killer? Well, a woman contacts me. How they do so, I'll keep to myself. If their references check out, we move on to business. She gives me the names and any other info I ask for. If I decide to take the job, we move on to money. If we agree on a number, then I go to work. With all that anonymity, I asked him how he made sure that he would get paid after he offed someone. It appeared my choice of words made him laugh. It probably wouldn't be wise to tell you that part. We professionals have to keep some secrets to ourselves. Okay, fair enough. Well then, how does a client know you've completed the job? I regretted asking the question even before I finished asking it. Even though it was a stupid question, he still entertained me with an answer, albeit with a tinge of sarcasm in his voice. We live in a time with a 24-hour news cycle and multiple social media outlets. Don't you think if your dad died suddenly, that someone's not going to contact your mother first? If you don't discover it on your own, someone is going to tell you. Once I'm paid, my relationship with the customer ends. She's ultimately on her own after that. The last part of his answer brought up another question in my mind. If something goes wrong, per se, and she gets arrested or implicates herself, what do you do? He thought for a moment before answering. I imagine he was considering how much he should say to a stranger driving his taxi. Some contingencies have been put in place to protect myself. First off, if I have done my job right, the client shouldn't have any information about me to give to the cops. And if, on the off chance, I screw up so badly that she can, I have multiple exit strategies. I certainly won't let the police get their hands on me. None of us get to live forever. There were a few times I had to remind myself that this was a game. He made it fun, nonetheless. His imagination and forethought wowed me. We had been playing this game for hours before I had thought to ask him how he got started in his business. I joined the army fresh out of high school. It seemed my work caught the attention of my superiors. They referred me to a couple of gentlemen in the government, and I worked for them for 10 years before I made the decision to go into business for myself. I gotta tell you, mister, you're really good at this stuff. You really should be a storyteller, if that's not what you're really doing for a living. I'm seriously impressed. And I wasn't blowing smoke. This was the most fun I had had driving a cab in my entire life. I was used to dealing with drunks and arrogant businessmen. This was a blast. Thank you, young man. I appreciate everything you have shown me tonight. I could tell by the way he was talking the night was coming to an end. It was just as well. The sun would be up soon, and I was beginning to flag myself. I took the opportunity to ask one more question, one I should have asked far earlier. He had said earlier in the night that he was in town on business. Did that mean he was here to take care of someone? A sly grin grew across his face as he thought on his answer. As a matter of fact, I was. However, I received a message at the last minute to cancel the hit. I get to keep the half she had already given me, so I didn't mind. That's business. It happens on occasion. That's a woman's prerogative after all, isn't it? To change their minds. I hope her and her old man work it out. Anyhow, that's how I ended up with you. Just as the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, he pointed out a place to let him out. There were a few hotels at the end of the parking lot, and I assumed that was where he was headed. He reached over the seat and handed me 10 $100 bills. Before I could argue, he told me to keep the change. Keep the change, kid. You earned it. I had a great time tonight. Thank you, mister. I had a great time myself, and thank you most of all for that awesome story. As he stepped from the cab, he said one last thing. Thank you for showing me around tonight, Adam. Take care of Linda and stay out of trouble. I pulled out of the lot and headed for home. My hope was that Linda would have breakfast going. That was when it hit me, like a hammer. How did that man know my name? Not to mention my wife's. My license was nowhere he could have seen it. I reenacted the night's discussion in my head. There was never a point in which I told him. It would have ruined the game. I didn't ask him his, and there was no reason for me to tell him mine. Certainly not my wife's. How did he know I was married anyway? I hadn't worn a ring in years. I lost it down a drain and never found it. He could have guessed. The problem with that is Linda and I had just gotten back together last week. We had been separated and considering divorce for 2 years before that. When I pulled into the driveway of my house, a terrible idea came into my mind. Was there a possibility that guy wasn't making up a story? No one would dare tell someone, even a stranger, in such a bold and frank way, that he was a hitman. If he was serious, the fact he knew my name and my wife's could only mean one thing. Even if it was true, I wasn't ready to accept it. While Linda and I sat and ate that morning, I couldn't stop myself from watching her. I was terrified that my wife had wanted me dead. Even if she had changed her mind, there was no way she would admit it. If I did ask, either answer would most likely destroy the fragile peace we have built between us. I need to know. You listening, what do you think? Am I crazy, or is this really happening? This story takes place all the way back when I was still in high school. In order to earn money to fund my video game addiction, I regularly tutored this 11-year-old girl. We actually got along so well that the parents ended up asking me to babysit her and her little brother a couple times. One night in particular, the parents were meant to go downtown to watch a baseball game before a few drinks with friends, telling me they would be back earlier than midnight. Basic babysitting job, right? Wrong. Right around 8 o'clock in the evening, it started raining pretty hard. We all lived in a Gulf city at the time, and storms can blow in fast before turning into flooding really fast. Once it became horrifyingly clear we were in for one big storm, the parents tried to get home as quickly and safely as possible, but the streets had already started to flood, and apparently they ended up trapped in a parking lot. The irony was lost on me at the time, but not today. The kids' parents called and we agreed I would spend the night in their guest bedroom while they booked themselves into a motel. I had the kids go to bed while I sat up in the kitchen to do homework and watch Netflix. After a little while, I started to notice water seeping in from under the back doors. They had a large house with like 3 double doors to the back, so it was very large, with lots of square feet. I got every towel in the house and started wiping up the water and using the towels to block the door. After this had mostly been cleaned up, I went back to the kitchen table to watch more Netflix. Not much else I could do, right? But it couldn't have been any more than like 15 minutes later when the power cuts out and all the lights shut off. This freaked me out a bit, but I tried to stay as calm as I could. That's when the burglar alarm went off in the other room. I pretty much crapped my pants. I was in a pitch black house with 2 young kids surrounded by flooded roads that no one could drive on. After a minute or so of almost blind panic, I realized, to my horror, I was the closest thing in the house to an adult. There was no one looking after me. In fact, I was directly responsible for those kids. So I grabbed the biggest, sharpest kitchen knife I could find, then went to go check all the doors. They were all still closed, and no one was in the house. So I called the parents. It turns out the alarm went off when the power cut out, and I just needed to shut it off with a code upstairs. This happened about 3 more times over the next few hours. After the power came back on, I thought things had chilled out, but then we got a tornado warning. I went and got the kids from upstairs, and we all hung out in this study for about an hour until the warning passed. At this point, it was 2 a.m., and I passed out in the guest bedroom. The parents woke me up when they got home at around 7 a.m., and I drove home past giant fallen branches and stalled, abandoned cars. It was surreal, but thankfully, everyone was safe and well in the end. I have heard countless stories about other people's experiences with sleep paralysis, and I thought I would share my scariest ones. A lot of people have heard of the shadow people. I have had an unknown black force pin me down in bed, suffocating me. However, the other two instances I have had are more bizarre, and I still think about them quite often. About 4 years ago, I was 24. I still lived with my mom since I was in my second year of nursing school, and it was just easier to live at home while going to school. Going to bed one night, all seemed well until I woke up for no reason. I couldn't move or talk. I heard almost static mumbling sounds on my left. Completely terrified, I listen as I try desperately to move. Slowly, this static starts to get clearer, and I hear young voices. Children's voices. They began chanting, "You're going to die," and giggling after each chant. It was like they were singing a nursery rhyme. They chanted the same thing over and over again. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Logically in my head, I was telling myself this wasn't real. For all those that aren't religious, this may not seem like it makes sense, but I decided to pray in my head to make it stop. It was like I was screaming in my head because I couldn't physically speak. It felt like an eternity before it went away and I was able to move again. I rushed out of my room to my mom and told her everything. I didn't go back into my room that night. She looked at me with disbelief. I don't know if she truly believed me or understands sleep paralysis. Regardless, it's something I will never forget. My second story was around the same year. When sleep paralysis becomes a recurring theme every night, or every other night, I just started to sleep with the lights on. For added comfort, my cats would sleep on my bed and cuddle with me until I fell asleep. For a while, no instances of sleep paralysis occurred, so I just assumed this is what I needed to do each night. Like usual, I went to bed with the lights on, and one of my cats, Salem, curled up in my arm while I slept. I woke up with a feeling of all too familiar dread. I couldn't believe what was happening. I felt like I was being watched. To my horror, I can't make this up if I wanted to, disturbingly saw a white figure on the right side of my bed, standing very close to me. My heart felt like it dropped into my stomach. I see piercing, bright blue eyes staring at me. I glanced down at my cat, seemingly unaware of the figure and sleeping soundly. This eased me up a bit. Seeing this made me remind myself that this wasn't real. After a few moments, the figure disappeared. Even with the lights on, I did not feel safe. I don't experience sleep paralysis as much as I used to, thankfully. But those are two instances I will never forget. And if you suffer from sleep paralysis, you know exactly what I went through and how horrible it truly is. When my mom was 16, a year before she got pregnant with me, she was having the same dream every night for about a year. In this dream, she and a boy around her age would be surrounded by a group of men in a cemetery. My mom had no idea who the boy was, but every night, a man from the group would stand in front of them and ask, "Would you die for him?" My mom would answer no, being that she had no idea who the guy was. The man would ask the boy, "Would you die for her?" The boy would reply no as well. One night, however, the man asked the boy first, "Will you die for her?" He said no as usual. The man then turned to my mom and asked her, "Will you die for him?" She isn't sure why, maybe out of curiosity of what would happen, or fear of getting hurt. She said yes. The man stared at her. The man then said, "Your fate is sealed, and so is his." But this time, he didn't hurt them. She just woke up. My mom was a model, and on this specific day, she had a fashion show that she would be doing in another nearby city. Her aunt had come to drive and accompany her to the show, along with my mom's best friend. Everything was fine that morning. My mom got dressed, her friend came over, her aunt arrived, and they piled into the car, ready for the 3 to 4 hour drive. While on the highway, my mom noticed she had forgotten something at home. They were only about 10 minutes out at this point, with plenty of time to spare, so they turned around to go grab it. Just as they turned around, listening to music and singing along, my mom's friend asked to turn the music down. "Do you hear that?" she asked. My mom and her aunt were silent for a moment before hearing a strange scraping sound, like metal on concrete. They looked around for the source of the noise, but saw nothing around them. There were no other cars on the road. When they got back to the house, my mom ran inside as her friend and aunt checked the car to make sure the strange noise wasn't the car. Everything looked fine to them, and my grandfather even checked and gave them the okay. This all took maybe 20 to 30 minutes. With that, they shrugged it off and headed back towards the highway. When they finally got on, the highway was now covered with police cars, blocking off a lane where they could see a horrible accident had taken place. My mom's aunt approached the scene slowly as a cop waved her down, telling her to stop. Give us a second to clear this lane of debris." "What happened?" her aunt asked, clearly shocked at the scene. "It was a head-on collision," he replied. "When did this happen? We were just here 30 minutes ago." The officer looked shocked. It happened about 30 minutes ago. You didn't see anything?" They explained that they had heard a strange noise that sounded like metal scraping against concrete, before exchanging worried looks as her aunt asked, "Is everyone okay?" "No, ma'am. You ladies are lucky. It sounds like if you had been running even 3 seconds late, that could have been you." With that, the officer waved them through and told them to have a nice day. But as they passed the wreckage, my mom looked out the window to see them removing a body from the car. Her heart sank when she realized it was the boy from her dream. She never had that dream again.
I'm 21 years old and from a small town in Sweden. Some years ago, me and a couple of guy friends from school decided to go into the forest to camp out for a night. It wasn't the first time we did this, but we had never been to this particular spot before. My friends were Phil and Ned. We had chosen to go camping on a warm and sunny Friday in July. We had our parents drop us off at the entrance to the forest trail. Ned had chosen this spot because he had heard his grandfather speak of it before he passed away not too long ago. There was apparently a camping spot with a fire area, and beyond that there was going to be a small lake. We walked for about an hour on an old gravel road surrounded by thick forest. It took much longer to get there than we anticipated, and being a typical girl, I overpacked. Finally, we made it to the spot, which actually had a small little camping shack with 3 walls, a roof, and a wooden floor. We walked straight down to the lake after unpacking a bit, then jumped into the water to cool off after such a long and sweaty walk. Phil started a fire, while me and Ned carved sticks to grill some hot dogs on. We stayed by the fire all evening and passed around a bottle of vodka that Phil had taken from his parents, and we talked about life and how things were going for us. The sun was beginning to set around that time. Our talking was suddenly stopped when we heard a twig snapping behind us. I froze, not wanting to look behind me. Ned got up and got closer to where the sound had come from, and began to laugh nervously. "Maybe we got a thirsty rabbit on our hands," he said, as he took a sip from the vodka bottle. He sat back down and we started to relax again, trying to laugh it off. We continued talking a bit longer, until we grew tired. Ned then went to go and relieve himself behind some trees by the shack, and as I stood up from my place to go to my sleeping bag, I heard the sound of someone crying. Petrified, I turned around to look where the sobbing was coming from, and there was another cry. I screamed and ran over to Phil. He was shocked by my reaction because he apparently had not heard the sobbing. Ned came out from the side of the shack and asked what was going on. I explained myself to them as best I could. They went silent and began to listen to the forest around them. The sobbing didn't come again, but now we did realize that there were no sounds coming at all from the forest. It was too silent. I was close to freaking out, but the boys tried to explain it away as my imagination and the vodka. We did not want to stay awake anymore, so we threw the last bit of firewood on the fire and got into our sleeping bags on the cold shack floor. I stayed as close to the others as possible. We all had a hard time falling asleep that night, but eventually I did drift off. I then woke up to the sound of Phil whispering in my ear. He said to me, "Wake up, there's a girl by the fire." I was too exhausted to understand what he was talking about, but I looked over by the fire anyway. It was dark, and the fire had almost burned out down to ash, and gave the surroundings a faint reddish glow. But I did see a little girl's silhouette, illuminated faintly by the glow past the fireplace, just by the spot I had previously been sitting. I looked over at Ned, but he was fast asleep. Then I looked back at Phil, but he just stared at the girl. She had her head in her hands and was wearing a dirty brown dress. Her hair was long, blonde, and messy, and she herself looked to be no more than 3 years old. We lay there for what felt like forever before Phil stood up and looked at me, signaling me to do the same. I followed his lead and did as he did. Now Ned woke up and was just about to say something when Phil signed for him to be silent, and he pointed to where the little girl stood. The silence was again broken by the sound of sobbing coming from the girl, but she had not moved. A cold chill went through me as I realized that it was the same sounds I had heard in the forest before. I wanted to believe that the little girl was just lost, but I knew deep down in my bones that this was no normal little girl. Phil walked closer to her and tried to talk to her. "Hi, my name is Phil. Don't be scared. Are you lost?" The little girl stopped sobbing, and we waited for her to respond. She lifted her head up slowly. I expected to see a deformed-looking face to greet us, but she was gorgeous. Until her mouth began to stretch wide open, twice the size of any normal person, and she screamed. I fell backwards and hit my head on the hard, damp floor. I was stunned by the pain and got a splitting headache. When I came to my senses, I was really starting to freak out. But the little girl had disappeared. "What the heck was that?" I screamed. The boys did not answer me. They were already stuffing their things into their backpacks frantically screaming that we needed to get out of here. I tried to do the same, but because of the pain in my head, I was not as fast as them. I ended up having to leave some of my stuff behind. But I didn't care, as long as we got out of there fast. We started running down the old gravel road that led to the parking lot. It was pitch dark on that road, which was only lit by the faint light coming from our phones. Ned tripped on something and fell to the ground. We stopped and helped him up to his feet again, but he had hurt his foot on the fall, so we had to slow down. We started to calm down too, thinking that the little girl had not followed us, but we didn't say a word to each other. Phil called his father and begged him to come and pick us up as soon as he could. He was a bit annoyed by being awakened this late, but reluctantly agreed to come. We maybe had 10 minutes left to get to the parking lot when I stupidly looked behind us. I saw the little girl standing there, not even 5 meters behind us, with her head in her hands. I started crying and the boys did not have to look behind us. I wanted them to know that she was there, because the girl began to sob again, but louder than before. We tried to go as fast as we could and finally got to the parking lot, but Phil's father was not there yet. We were not going to stay there and wait, so we kept on walking until Phil's father met us by the road and picked us up. He drove us back to their house. My mother came soon after Phil's father had called her, and Ned's mother went by to pick us up. I didn't speak about it for a couple of days. My parents were worried, but they didn't press me to talk. I eventually said that we had simply encountered a scary moose that had come into our campsite, and they believed me. They don't believe in strange or supernatural things like ghosts or spirits, but my grandmother did. So I went to her and had her explain to me what she thought it was. She said it was a mealing, a spirit of a child that had perished and was buried without being baptized. Usually the mother of the child had given birth out of wedlock or in secret, and ended the child's life soon after. There are apparently a lot of old folk tales about mealings and encounters with them, but usually in old houses where the mothers had buried them under the floorboards. I haven't been back to that forest, and I'm not planning to. Anyone who has ever been to the Rockies, and especially anyone who has ever lived there, will tell you that the mountains are colder than they look in all those old cowboy movies. It's a grasping cold that makes your whole body ache, unlike the dull, numbing cold of Michigan or Pennsylvania in the wintertime. And that cloying, gripping cold is precisely what I found myself experiencing on a dark October morning in Idaho not quite 2 years ago. I've been a pretty avid hunter and outdoorsman for most of my life, and ever since I turned 18 I've been applying for the tag lottery in a few states out west, hoping for a chance to hunt some mountain goat. Finally, after several years of applying, my number came up in Idaho, and I soon received my tag in the mail. Unfortunately, due to a few scheduling conflicts, I couldn't go on my hunt until the last week of October, towards the end of the legal season, and well past the mid-weather days of August and September. Now, a hunt for mountain goats is one of the most physically demanding and skill-intensive endeavors a hunter can undertake in North America, a true adventure of a lifetime. Even in ideal conditions, you have to hike steep mountains, have a good set of binoculars and sharp eyes, know how to camp efficiently, and of course you need to be a crack shot. Late in the season, such a hunt becomes even more strenuous, due to the shorter hours of daylight and the more hostile weather. Not to mention the fact a lot of local predators are in overdrive, trying to bulk up before the lean winter months. However, I wasn't about to let a little bit of cold wind and snow come between me and one of my ultimate dream hunts, so I immediately began planning. I was worried I'd have to make the cross-country drive, But luckily for me, an old college friend of mine was working as an engineer for a big cobalt mine in eastern Idaho, and he was willing to let me ship most of my gear to him ahead of time. Besides, he had an elk tag that he wanted to fill for the season, so we could camp together and help one another hunt and scout. In the final few weeks leading up to my trip, I began checking the local news from the area I'd be hunting, just to keep an eye out for severe weather or other hazards. As a side effect, I got to see all the small town news from western Idaho as well. Most of it was pretty mundane, but one story that caught my eye was the mysterious disappearances of 2 hunters who were last seen on a swath of public land just southeast of where my buddy and I would be hunting. Of course, people go missing from big state parks and public hunting lands all the time, and they're usually found alive in just a few days, thanks to the hard work of trained professionals. Maybe they strayed too far from the trails and got lost, or maybe they took a tumble in some rocky ground and hurt themselves. Typically nothing too out of the ordinary. But occasionally, there are accidents and animal attacks that people don't walk away from, so I always pay attention to stories like that in order to prevent something similar from happening to me. The day of the big trip finally arrived, and after a long flight and an even longer drive, I found myself at a little hotel in a small town called Slate Creek, not too far from the huge tract of public land we would go hunting on. My friend arrived less than an hour later. We quickly got settled in before heading down the street to grab some supper at a local diner. We had a good time and caught up over dinner, but at one point I happened to look up at the TV on the wall, and the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen ominously read, "Missing hunters found slain near Hell's Canyon. Mountain lion attack suspected." This definitely caught my attention, because a mountain lion won't usually attack more than one person, so there is safety in numbers. However, on the rare occasions that they do attack a group of more than one person, the attacks aren't usually fatal. A couple of fit hikers or a hunting party of grown adults is usually more than capable of forcing even a determined cougar to retreat. This is especially true for 2 hunters, who would certainly have been armed with rifles, and probably would have been toting pistols around, and skinning knives as well. Any mountain lion capable of mauling 2 heavily armed outdoorsmen to death simultaneously was certainly not one I wanted to meet. An adult cougar can have a territorial range of up to 300 square miles, and this put the region of our hunt easily within its patrol range, considering we'd be camped out and hunting right on the edge of Hell's Canyon. However, my buddy and I had talked previously about the possibility of running into predators during the hunt. We had packed accordingly, with him carrying a 10mm automatic and me lugging my .44 Magnum. Even still, we decided to take some extra precautions. To that end, we got up early the next day, and after I had enjoyed what would likely be my last hot shower for a week, we met up at a trading post in town which dealt in all sorts of camping and hunting gear. We picked up a few perimeter bells for our campsite, and we each bought a box of hard-cast bullets designed for penetrating thick and muscular hides of predators. They may kick you like a mule, but they certainly don't play around when it comes to stopping power. While in the trading post, we asked the owner, a quiet man of about 50, with salt and pepper hair, and skin weathered from decades of outdoorsmanship, if he had ever seen anything like the cougar attack that had been on the news last night. I was hoping he could give us some advice on protecting our camp, but what we got instead was far more unsettling.
"I've seen the wilderness out here kill a lot of people in a lot of ways, but it's been a long time since I saw anything as brutal as this. Usually if you find more than one person at a time that's been killed, it was the work of something walking on 2 legs, not 4, if you catch my drift. Every now and then a couple of hikers will walk up on a sow grizzly with cubs, and we'll find them all mangled up in a week or so. But bears always leave clear tracks behind, and it's not the right time of year for them to be raising cubs anyway. No, sir. The last time anything like this happened was about 2 decades back, when we had a whole rash of weird happenings. Everything from house cats and hens all the way up to prize-winning bulls were found gutted, mauled, chewed on, and otherwise turned into a fine red paste for nigh on a month. It sure put a damper on business around here, I'll tell you that much. The rangers said it was a cougar back then too, but I didn't believe them then any more than I do now.
My buddy and I looked at one another, uneasily, before turning back to the store owner and asking, if it wasn't a cougar, then what was it? The man behind the counter simply grinned and continued his tale.
Well, after a couple weeks of livestock getting mauled, some local ranchers decided to take matters into their own hands. They went out hunting one night and bagged themselves 3 of the biggest mountain lions anybody around here had ever seen. And when the rangers examined the cougars, they found that all 3 of them were related. You see, if a mother puma has more than one kit, she'll teach them all to hunt in the same way at the same time. The rangers were thinking that the mother of those 3 had brought them up hunting livestock, so that was all they knew. A couple of folks weren't so sure, though. One old-timer that lived up in the hills told stories of a behemoth cat that had been stalking the woods around his cabin, and it wasn't just some mountain lion either. He said it stood taller than even the largest mountain lion, and its pelt was black as sin. This man had fought in 2 wars, but said that this creature scared him stiff, and not 2 nights later the worst incident of the whole string happened right here, in town. One of the rangers, some rookie who had just moved here from California, was walking back to the ranger station from the diner. Keep in mind that's a walk of less than 300 yards, and the rest of the rangers at the station never saw him again. They didn't find anything left of that boy the next day, save for a slick of blood and his freshly shined shoes, left at the scene of the attack like he'd been plucked right up out of them. Not long after that, though, a group of rangers was seen sweeping the town and heading off into the wilderness, and from what I've heard, they followed that thing's tracks all the way up to an old silver mine back in the hills. None of the rangers have ever talked much about exactly what they saw up there, but several hikers in the area reported hearing a hail of gunfire right at dusk. Sure enough, the killings and maulings never happened again after that night. But I'll tell you what, if there's another one of those things out there roaming around the wilds now, then you can bet your bottom dollar I won't be sticking around to see how it works out this time around.
It was a hell of a story, to be sure, and it took me some time to take it in. But it couldn't be true, right? Not all true. I mean, no cat that big and that aggressive could possibly remain hidden on public game land, I told myself. The 2 of us thanked the man for the info and paid for our ammo and supplies, and after that, we got on our way as quickly as we could. Our time was limited, and listening to the man's story had put us a bit behind schedule. Our last stop on the way out of town was at the ranger station to check in and inform the rangers of where we'd be and what we would be doing. There was only one officer on duty since it was so late in the season, so I figured we'd probably be able to get through the check-in pretty quickly. But as we answered his questions about our firearms and tags, I thought back to the outfitter's story. I asked the old ranger if there had been any mutilated animals found recently, or if there were any dangerous wildlife in the area that we should be aware of. After all, we would be camping back in the wilderness for close to a full week. The ranger froze for a few moments, and he quietly zipped my .30-06 rifle back into its case before raising his eyes to meet mine. I suppose you heard about those 2 bodies over at Hell's Canyon. To tell you the truth, there's a lot of nooks and crannies in these hills where something could be hiding, but we've got our best men out there working to keep the place safe. Still, you 2 should be extra careful out there, and if I were you, I wouldn't split up. I'm really not supposed to do this, but if you've got a notepad handy, I'll give you boys our audio frequency,
and you just tell us if you find anything unusual out there." This was way out of the ordinary, since game wardens and rangers never give out their radio frequency. If everyone in the area with a radio could listen in on them, a poacher could have a heyday with all the unsecured information. For the Park Service to be handing out secure channel information, they must have been truly desperate for as many eyes and ears as possible. To make things even more unsettling, according to the sign-in book, there were only 4 other hunters in this section of the wilderness, 2 individuals and 1 duo. Of course, there could be others out there that hadn't signed in, an extremely stupid idea in such a large and dangerous wilderness. But this late in the season, I certainly didn't expect the area to be crowded. Even though being so isolated and alone was less than ideal if there was truly something dangerous roaming the area, I have to admit I was relieved that I wouldn't have to worry about anyone else spooking the game. We finished our check-in at the ranger station by noon, and it was finally time to head back into the wilderness for what would hopefully be the hunt of a lifetime. In fact, it would definitely be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but not in the way we initially expected. We drove my buddy's pickup as far as we could go along winding gravel roads, well back into the public game lands, and when we finally found a good area to park on the side of the road, we packed all our camping supplies into our 2 huge backpacks, starting to hike even further into the wilderness on foot. After all, if you really want to find where all the record book animals are, you have to go where most hunters won't. All in all, we probably hiked a little over a mile further uphill to get to a good base camp location. We finally got settled into a nice little clearing surrounded by dense forest by about 6 p.m. The sun was just setting over the beautiful Rocky Mountain landscape. We pitched our tents and set up a few lines of string with small bells on them around the edges of the clearing, and then we finally stopped for a simple but filling supper of canned soup cooked over our small camp stove. I was so tired from hiking and so happy to be out in the wilderness on such an adventure that I completely forgot about all the strange rumors and unsettling happenings. The next 2 days were free of any weird incidents. We scouted the ridgelines and timber thickets, searching for just the right place to set up the perfect shot, and the whole time we never saw anything out of the ordinary. Every now and again, though, we would hear our handheld radios crackle softly, and we would always stop what we were doing and listen close. Most of the time it was just a ranger checking in and giving his location, but more than once the voice on the other side was uneasy, as one of the rangers called in finding a severely mutilated elk or mule deer. What was even more ominous was that if we checked our maps and marked out the locations where mutilated animals had been found, a pattern started to emerge, and it looked like whatever was leaving the mauled animals in its wake could be headed our way. At the end of the 3rd day, we had found the absolute perfect place to lie in wait for a big billy goat. We were planning on getting there early the next morning. We were both bone tired from hiking all day, but as we sat around the warm fire, waiting for our dinner of sausages and hash browns to finish cooking, we both became aware of an approaching sound in the woods beyond the clearing. Both of us were reluctant to leave the warmth of the fire, but finally I made myself stand up and head toward the tree line with my .44 in one hand and a lantern in the other. There was barely a sliver of the waning moon in the sky, so my visibility was limited to how far my lantern could reach in the coal-black darkness. The sounds grew closer and closer, and soon the crackle of leaves and branches was accompanied by heavy breathing. I brought my revolver up and pulled the hammer back, bracing myself for some horrible demon cat to come bursting out of the shadows of the woods. Instead, I heard what sounded like a human voice call out from about 50 feet into the tree line. "Hello? Anyone there?" Relieved, I called back. "Yeah, there's a clearing not far in this direction. Just come towards my voice slowly." "What are you doing out here this late without a light?"
A few moments later, a pair of men dressed in camouflage clothes and safety orange toboggans stumbled out of the woods and into the light of my lantern. The two men looked haggard and spooked, but after taking a moment to catch their breath, they introduced themselves. I recognized their names from the sign-in sheet at the ranger station, and they explained that they had followed a wounded elk into the brush and had gotten lost without their flashlights. Being lost in the woods at night is a scary enough concept on its own, but what they told me next sent a real shiver down my spine. They explained that they had shot a fine bull elk from across a gully, and before they could track him through the brush, they had to hike down the side of one mountain and then up the slope of another. By the time they crossed the gulch, found the blood trail, and began tracking the wounded bull, it had been over an hour. They spent another 45 minutes or so following blood splatter and broken branches through the brush. When they finally came to a clearing, they hadn't found exactly the site they'd been expecting. Sure enough, what they found was the carcass of the elk sitting there in the middle of the clearing, but it had been torn apart. Limbs and bones tossed aside, entrails had been torn out and devoured. Large hunks of meat still hung on the bones in places, so whatever had been going at it had had its fill with the innards, or had simply been mutilating the carcass for fun. Both hunters said they had gotten an extremely uneasy feeling there, and they'd been debating on whether or not to try and salvage the rack, when they realized that darkness was beginning to fall. Yeah, so we hightailed it out of there as quick as we could. We must have gotten turned around somewhere in the underbrush, because we certainly didn't end up back where we started. Thank goodness we finally found you two, or we might still have been wandering around till morning. The two of them were clearly exhausted, so we offered to let them share our campsite for the night, throwing a few extra sausages on the griddle. They thanked us, and said they'd be on their way at first light. As we ate, I asked if they could think of any more details that might reveal the identity of whatever had mauled the wounded elk. They said they'd found a few footprints, but in the fading light and the mud and blood from the carcass, they hadn't really been able to tell exactly how large the prints had been, though they both agreed that the tracks looked like those of a mountain lion, or perhaps a bobcat. Moreover, they both reported feeling like they were being watched during their walk through the woods in the dark. We never saw anything, but occasionally we'd hear a rustling in the brush, or we'd catch a quick glimpse of movement out of the corner of our eyes, or all the hairs on the back of our necks would stand up all of a sudden. But we figured it might have just been our heads playing tricks on us in the dark. We talked for a few more minutes as we made our plans for the morning, but soon our exhaustion got the better of us, and we all decided to hit the hay for the night. We doused the fire, and soon we retired to our tents. My buddy would be staying with me in my tent that night, and the other hunters would be sharing his tent. It didn't take long for all of us to fall asleep, since a light snow had begun to fall and our warm quilts and sleeping bags had never seemed more cozy or inviting. At some point during the night, however, I woke up from my peaceful slumber. I'm a pretty light sleeper, so at first I figured my friend had just shifted in his sleep or something. But soon I heard it. The soft tinkling of bells. Something had bumped the small line of bells strung around the perimeter of the campsite. Now at first I assumed it was probably one of the two guests. Maybe one of them had gotten up to use the bathroom out in the trees, and maybe they had bumped the trip line by accident. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It was like someone was playing with the string and bells, swatting and jerking the line to elicit the quiet jingle of the little tin bells. Again and again, the string thrummed from an impact, and the bells tinkled as though they were tossed around on the line. By this point, I was starting to get nervous, and I reached down to the floor of the tent next to my sleeping bag to find my .44 in its holster. I'm not sure if I made a noise as I moved or if whatever it was just got bored with the line of bells, but as soon as I sat up, the jingling stopped, and the night again fell silent, with no noise whatsoever, except for the soft crinkle of falling snow. The next morning we rose early, coming out of our warm cocoons at 3:50. We brewed a quick cup of coffee in the morning darkness and munched on some trail mix as we got our backpacks ready. However, when we were about to set out for the ridgeline, which we had found the day before, our flashlights caught something menacing pressed into the fresh snow. Coming into the campsite, from the same place where the two hunters had stumbled out of the woods the night before, was a trail of big paw prints. They followed the exact path those two hunters had taken from the edge of the woods to the fire pit, and then they made a large circle around the tent the other two men were sleeping in, before crossing the campsite once more, and ending before the line of bells on the far side of the site, only to continue again about 15 feet further into the woods. It was like something had jumped the bells to exit the clearing, all without making a sound. So what I did hear the night before must have been the thing playing, or rather testing the bells on the way into the campsite. Maybe it was amusing itself with our security measures it was smart enough to avoid triggering on the way out of the site. Now I was definitely creeped out, and I decided that this, combined with the story of the mutilated elk from the day before, qualified as unusual enough to report to the ranger service. I called it in over the radio, giving the sleepy ranger on duty our location, and quietly rolling my eyes at his reprimand for using a secure frequency. He said that somebody would be out this way in a few hours, and to just stay put. Of course, if we wanted to be in position on time, we couldn't afford to wait a few hours. We opted instead to just leave a note taped to the inside flap of the other hunter's tent before going on our way. It was a bone-chillingly cold morning to be hiking up and down steep mountain ridges with a heavy pack and a rifle, but I knew there was no other way I'd be bagging a nice goat, so we continued on our way with dogged determination. We finally made it to the base of the ridgeline that we would be setting up on, and we decided to take a brief break before hiking up to the last hill, getting into position. As we were sitting there at the base of the mountain ridge, eating a few more handfuls of trail mix to keep our energy up, we kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corners of our eyes in the lavender light of pre-dawn. It was never anything we could focus on, but every now and again it would seem as if a shadow in the trees would move, or a new shadow would appear where there hadn't been one a moment ago. It was more than enough to set me on edge, and I quietly cycled my rifle's bolt. I put a round into the chamber, just in case. Pretty soon we noticed that the sky was getting brighter, so we decided to go ahead and hike up to the top of the ridge then. We made it about halfway up the steep hill before my buddy pointed out just how eerily calm the morning was. We hadn't noticed it on the way there due to the strenuous nature of the hike, combined with the fact that it's really not out of the ordinary for everything to be silent in the woods at 4 a.m., on the morning after a snowstorm no less. However, now that the sun was beginning to light up the sky, small animals should have been out skittering around. Birds should have been flitting from branch to branch as elk bugled in the distance. But there was nothing. Just the occasional plop of a gob of snow falling from a tree branch. We made it to the top of the ridge, and boy, let me tell you, that view alone was worth the early morning trek. Frost glistened on every tree in the valley below, and a serene blue-white carpet of fresh snow covered the opposite peak like icing on a cake. I took it all in for a moment before getting down on my stomach and setting my pack up as a rest for my rifle, as my friend quietly rummaged in his pack for his binoculars. Just then, however, a powerful feeling of being watched came over me, and when I rolled over onto my side to look around, I nearly soiled myself in fright. About 30 yards up the ridge to my right, a pitch-black shape sat perched like a gargoyle on a snow-covered rock. It had the distinct profile of a big cat, but its fur was so dark that I couldn't make out any features of its body, except for the piercing amber-colored eyes that stared right back at me. It was massive, certainly bigger than any mountain lion I'd ever seen. Furthermore, its ears stood straight up, coming to tufted points like a lynx or bobcat. I did not know exactly what it was, but I knew without a doubt that it wasn't there to ask for a cup of sugar. I kicked my buddy lightly with my outstretched leg, and it didn't take him long to spot the predator eyeing us from afar. We were stuck in a standoff, not wanting to make any sudden movements, as the cat just stared at us from its perch. My revolver was strapped on my hip, and while it would have been easier to aim at close range with it, it would be slow and awkward to bring up from my prone position. I heard my friend pull his 10mm out of its holster, but he was in a bad shooting position as well. Instead, my best option would be to turn and fire with my rifle. I flicked the safety off, and its distinctive click sent the cat into a low pouncing position. It began to slink down off its rocky vantage point. I knew it was now or never, and I whispered to my friend, "You ready?" And he whispered back, "Go for it." So I did. As quickly as I could, praying harder than I ever had before, I wheeled around to bring my rifle to bear, and I'll never forget the sight of making eye contact with that thing through my scope. I fired, the shot echoing across the silent mountain range like the bang of a judge's gavel. I could not see anything except for a blur of movement in my scope, but my friend later told me that I had hit it just under its massive collarbone. He said that he saw a spray of coal-black hair come off the beast as it charged. The creature screeched loud enough to wake the dead, and it tumbled, rolling downhill a few yards before getting back to its feet and running off through the snow-covered woods with alarming speed as my friend fired after it with his pistol. We both just sat there for a few moments, collecting ourselves and coming down off the adrenaline high. There was no way we were going to go chasing after that thing, but we also didn't want to stay there on the ridge in case it decided to come back. Besides, our hunt was ruined for the day anyway, as so much gunfire certainly would have scared away any animals in the area. We decided to make our way back to the campsite as soon as we could. Before we left, however, I wanted to have a look at the thing's tracks to see if they matched the ones at our campsite. The paw prints in the snow were enormous, and they were clearly feline. Cats keep their claws retracted as they walk, leaving only the indentations of the pads of their paws. Still, even the largest cougar tracks I've ever seen looked small in comparison to these, and they were pressed deeply into the snow, even penetrating to the mud underneath in some places, indicating that the animal had to have weighed an enormous amount. As I surveyed the tracks, I found a few tufts of oily black fur, but there wasn't a single drop of blood anywhere to be seen, despite the fact that I had nailed it dead center with a 30-06 at less than 20 yards. I was curious for sure, but certainly not curious enough to follow the thing's tracks into the brush. So as soon as we both made sure our handguns were loaded and our holsters were unbuttoned, we got on our way. We made good time heading back downhill, and much to our relief, a little bit of the life seemed to have returned to the forest, with nuthatches chirping and squirrels scampering through the fresh snow. We had made it about 2/3 of the way back towards our campsite, when we encountered 2 men in rangers' uniforms coming up the trail in the opposite direction. They were armed to the teeth, with one toting a black tactical shotgun, and the other carrying a semi-automatic rifle. They both had body armor over their green uniforms, with plenty of extra ammunition practically dripping off of them. They asked us if the camp just down the trail was ours, and when we said yes, they both breathed a sigh of relief, saying that they had heard our flurry of gunfire earlier and had assumed the worst. We continued hiking hurriedly back towards the campsite, and as we walked, we told the 2 rangers what happened. When we described the animal to them, however, they both shot one another a dour look before saying, "Yeah, you boys sure are lucky to have survived a cougar attack like that." My friend and I looked at one another in stunned silence for a moment, and asked them if they had even been listening to our description. "I've seen cougars, heck, I've hunted cougars, and I've been hunted by cougars." The rangers looked at me sympathetically for a moment before continuing to hike in silence, but by then we were nearly to the campsite. Although when we emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing, It looked much different than when we had left it a few hours ago. The whole clearing was crawling with people. Some were rangers decked out in tactical gear, like the two that had come to meet us, and others were rangers in regular uniforms. Some were dressed in the blue and gold uniforms of local police, too. Cameras flashed left and right in the woods beyond the clearing, and our tents had both been neatly packed and placed in an organized pile, along with our cooler and a few other things at one edge of the campsite. The other two hunters from the night before were nowhere to be seen. Our jaws hung open in disbelief, and soon enough, a tall man in a clean and well-fitted ranger's uniform approached us, telling us that he believed it was in our best interest to pack up and leave the area as quickly as possible. We did agree that the campsite didn't feel safe anymore, but when we asked to simply relocate our camp to another section of the game reserve, his expression turned dark, and he retorted with, "I asked you boys to leave. Now you're going to cooperate, right?" I looked at my friend again, and he simply shrugged, unsure of what other options we really had. After a few seconds, I simply gave in and said, "You got it, Chief. I'll head to the truck," before grabbing one of my tents and slinging it over my shoulder. When we reached the state road where my buddy had parked the truck, there must have been at least 15 or 20 other vehicles there, lining the shoulder of the small gravel road in both directions. We packed the truck, and we returned to town in silence. Once we were back to civilization, I checked back into the small inn we had stayed at on our first night in town. It would have been cheaper to stay there for the next few days than to reschedule my flight last minute. My buddy left for home on the other end of the state the next morning, and we never said another word about the bizarre experience. I spent the next 3 days quietly milling around town. One evening, while I was back at the local diner, I caught a snippet of local news broadcast featuring an interview with the same steely-eyed ranger that had told us to leave the reserve. Following the interview, there were a few snapshots of men in rangers' uniforms posing with the carcass of a moderately sized cougar, and the headline on screen emphatically stated, "Cougar behind hunter deaths trapped by local rangers." I finally returned home, albeit empty-handed, and I soon got back to my daily routine of work. However, less than a month later, a mysterious envelope with no return address arrived in the mail, and when I opened it, there was a full set of Idaho hunting tags with next year's season date stamped on them. Everything was there. Mule deer, elk, black bear, even mountain goat, all pre-approved and stamped with my name. Underneath the set of tags, there was a folded piece of stationery marked with the Forestry Service logo, which bore the handwritten words, "Every year, say nothing." I haven't been back out west since, but I'm considering going back this year. This time, instead of my hunting gear, I think I'll bring a camera.